As an employer or a HR professional, you definitely have come across bereavement leave. In this Unpack the Holidays Act episode, I wanted to go back to basics and have a look at bereavement leave because the conversation has stopped. And it's not just about eligibility and requirements, but also what happens when you start getting those difficult and curly issues in the workplace around bereavements. Stick around because this episode is going to equip you with everything you need to navigate the workplace more confidently. Hi everyone, welcome back to Law Lens. My name is Sanam and thank you so much for tuning in today. We are back. Aren't you guys all excited? Because we're back. I'm so excited to be here behind the mic again. I know I feel like I say this every time. It feels like deja vu, but I'm sorry for being MIA. I have been trying to get my studio sorted because I am tired now of recording in a closet. Yes, I record out of a small little closet and I usually just have my mic on a stand and I've got all the cords hanging out of my laptop trying to make it work. But I have officially taken the leap and set up a studio and I'm officially coming out of the closet, I guess you can say, where I will be setting up all this sound paneling and everything on the walls so that there is no echo and I have a proper studio. So if you do hear a bit of an echo, then I do apologize, but I promise it will only get better. You will only have to deal with my screeching voice and no more echo after this episode. All right, so before we get into bereavement leave, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody that signed up to the newsletter. If you haven't already, then absolutely do. It was amazing to see how many people jumped on and signed up, and it is not your stock standard newsletter. I'm thinking about putting a meme in there every week when I send it out too. I love a good meme. Now, also, for everyone that's listening, thank you so much for tuning in. Please make sure that you subscribe and follow the podcast so that you get these weekly, timely insights straight to your inbox, unless I'm MIA, of course, which has happened. But we're back now, and we're back at it. So let's get into it. Bereavement leave is what we're talking about today. And I am interested about the fact that we don't really talk about bereavement leave. If you've noticed, sick leave, always a topic of discussion. You've got annual leave, even family violence leave, but we don't have much conversation that happens around bereavement leave. And you may be wondering why that is, because I'm wondering the same thing too. But I believe that it could be because it's a bit of a sensitive topic, it's a bit more taboo, and it's a lot easier to have the conversation around other areas. And plus, misuse of sick leave, yes, we see it. Misuse of bereavement leave, you don't really want to say that this person is misusing their bereavement leave, right? So that's why I feel like the conversation hasn't really come up too much. But like I said, today I want to take it back to basics and I want to have a look at bereavement leave and the eligibility, the requirements, as well as the curly issues that can come up, which we'll all get into. Now, firstly, let's talk about eligibility of bereavement leave. This is all set out in section 63, I believe, of the Holidays Act. But with bereavement leave, the way that the eligibility works is that after 6 months of continuous service, an employee will be entitled to bereavement leave. Now, if you've met the 6-month continuous service, let's say that you are a casual worker and we need to factor in some other things as well, because the whole idea of a casual worker, for example, is that you're not really continuing on your service. Every time you come in, it's a brand new engagement, right? But what happens when the casual starts looking a little bit more permanent? So when you have an employee that's 6-month continuous, they are very clear-cut, salaried employee, 40 hours a week, whatever it is, very easy to understand. But what the Holidays Act has done is it's also had parameters put in there for people that might not be deemed as permanent and might start looking more like that. So what I'm trying to say here is that you could also have somebody that's done their 6 months of continuous service and an average of 10 hours per week, including at least 1 hour a week or 40 hours a month. All employees, regardless of their employment status, permanent, fixed term, or casual, they're all entitled to this leave. Keep in mind 6 months of continuous service, and then when you're looking at those other outlier employees like casuals, then you're looking at an average of 10 hours per week, and that's including 1 hour a week or 40 hours a month. So like I said, permanent, fixed term, casual, they're all eligible. And what does their entitlement actually mean? Well, if they're eligible, then according to the Holidays Act, they get 3 days of paid leave for the death of a close family member, and that could be a child, a grandchild, a grandparent, parent, sibling, partner, or partner's parent. And then if they have extended family member, then they would get 1 day of paid leave for an extended family member or a situation where an employer recognizes that the employee is grieving. See how complicated that can get? A situation where the employer recognizes that the employee is grieving. Hard threshold to meet, right? In terms of how would you be able to gauge that? You would have to just use your empathy, good judgment, what a fair and reasonable employer would do. And this is where bereavement leave can get a bit tricky. And there is also bereavement leave offered in situations where there are miscarriages or stillbirths. This was changed by the Labour government in April 2021, and it basically extended the 3-day bereavement leave to factor in miscarriages and stillbirth. And what that would mean is that it applies to a mother-to-be, the mother's partner, the mother's former partner, a person who agreed to be the primary carer, and the partner of the person who agreed to be the primary carer. So it really does extend quite far out. And no, you shouldn't be asking for any kind of proof when it comes to the miscarriage or the stillbirth. Definitely don't go down that path, but we'll get into kind of proof when it comes to bereavement leave, because I am not naive to the fact that once in a while, in very rare circumstances, this can come up. So I just wanted to clarify what those 3 and 1 day criteria means. What it means is that you don't get just 3 days or 1 day per year. This was something that my father-in-law and I were talking about a couple of years ago when there was a bereavement in the family where his brother-in-law passed away. He said, I've already just taken leave a few months ago for another family member that passed. And I said, no, well, you get 3 days if it's a close family member per bereavement. You don't get 3 days for the entire year. And he was quite shocked, considering the fact that he's worked in New Zealand for decades. I mean, and this happens, right? People just go through their employment just like people employ people. And if you're suffering a bereavement, you're not going out checking the legislation to see what's going on. So what I'm trying to get at here is that, yes, you can take bereavement leave multiple times in the year. Now, employer obligations, I would say here is where it gets a little bit trickier. When you're looking at this scenario, how do you actually assess whether they get 3 days or the 1 day? 3 day, a lot easier, right? That it might be a grandparent, a child, a partner's parent, but that 1 day is really tricky. So I would say in terms of best practice and what's best to apply here is to look at the closeness of the employee's relationship with the deceased person. Also have a look at the responsibilities for all or any of the arrangements for the ceremonies relating to the death. Do they have any responsibilities? Are they going to be involved in any of the ceremonies or anything like that? And also having a look at if there are any cultural responsibilities that they have or that they need to be involved in when it comes to the death of that person. So it's all about looking at the closeness of the relationship, how involved they are, and what that means in terms of their grieving process and what's required of them. It is a broad brush and it is really hard, right? Because you're looking at so many different factors and you're really trying to assess in that moment when it's a high moment of sensitivity. And the last thing that they're thinking about is how their leave is going to be processed. So that's why I would say those are the key areas to go to. It doesn't require too much. It requires you to come from an empathetic place to just say to the employee, I'm so sorry to hear about that. What's been going on? Is there anything that you need support with or anything that I can help you with? And then taking it that extra step further and just opening that door for the conversation to say, I'm so sorry to hear that it was such and such that passed away. Are you going to be helping out with anything? How much time do you need? All of those kinds of conversations need to come out at that time, but from an empathetic and sympathetic point of view. Now, it's really important to make sure that you have paid for bereavement leave correctly. This is something that nobody talks about, and I don't really think that it can go very wrong, but just in case, I thought I'd throw this in there because Section 72 of the Holidays Act makes it very clear that an employer must pay bereavement leave in the pay that relates to the pay period in which the bereavement leave was taken. So that means don't delay your payments. If the employee is taking bereavement leave in this pay period, then when you do your pay run or your pay cycle, make sure they get paid within that time, because that would be a breach of the legislation. And the legislation has tons of little things like this as well. I wanted to get into what happens when you don't have your stock standard bereavements. Maybe you have a friend of the employee rather than a family member. Maybe it even goes so far as to say a pet. What happens in those scenarios? And I believe that this is something that's coming up more and more. And now we're looking at bereavement leave for other types of deaths, right? I remember the first time I had an experience in the workplace where a colleague lost their pet, and this colleague was distraught, to say the least. They were so upset. They visibly were upset. They had physical reactions to the death of their pet, and it was really difficult for them to cope. And they took a few weeks off of work. So it was quite serious for them. Now, the question is, can the employee actually take some bereavement leave for this? And if they say that it's their pet, then they're most likely going to be quite close to their pet. Technically, the law talks about the death of a person, not necessarily the death of an animal. But the question is, would you want someone that was so distressed to be in the workplace? Where if an employee is actually at work and they're suffering a bereavement or they're grieving, then how likely are they to be focused on their work? And how much could that affect the morale of other employees in the workplace? So that leads me to what happens when an employee wants more leave. What happens if you want to give the employee more leave? So if you have a scenario, let's say it's a family friend or it's a pet that they were close to, but they're not really an immediate family member like what's listed in the Holidays Act. If an employee wants to take additional bereavement leave, or hasn't yet met the 6-month criteria, their employer can, at their discretion, so you absolutely can, allow them to take the bereavement leave in advance or use their annual leave. So you can give the employee, at your discretion, more bereavement leave and allow them to take that bereavement leave when they necessarily aren't entitled to it. You can also ask them if they'd want to use their annual leave as well. I would be a bit cautious about sick leave because they wouldn't be sick in that scenario. Obviously, after hearing the news, if they're having some sort of physical reaction to it or anything like that and they're feeling really unwell, then that might be sick leave in that scenario. Payment of bereavement leave should only be made if the employee would have normally worked that day. If the employee has scheduled annual leave already and they suffer a bereavement in the middle, you need to give them their bereavement leave days instead of their annual leave days. So you need to give them what they're entitled to first in terms of what they would normally get. And then if circumstances change, then that's when you have a look at applying the right kind of leave. Just like if somebody's on annual leave and then they fall sick, then that's when they would get sick leave for those days instead of annual leave. I wanted to go into a very curly topic, and it is around misusing bereavement leave. Now, we never, ever want to think that people do this, but I have personally seen it in my time working as a lawyer and working in advisory, and I'm sure some of you may have seen it out there as well. And misusing bereavement leave, this actually comes up because I was in a community forum which is run by Lisa Young. It's called HRHQ, amazing community, by the way. If you need to bounce ideas off of other HR professionals, seek some advice from other people as well around how to tactfully and commercially handle HR and ER issues. But I was in that community and this question popped up and it was really interesting. It was around a HR professional feeling like maybe an employee might be misusing bereavement leave. And it was very difficult for them to say all of this and to have this conversation because you always want to caveat it with, not that I'm saying that this is exactly what they're doing, but I just want to know, what do I do in this scenario? And the death of a loved one can be an extremely challenging time for people, right? So that's why I would say if you've come up against a situation where you feel like an employee might be misusing bereavement leave, the first thing I want you to think about is using your discretion, understanding this is a sensitive time, seeing if it's really worthwhile for a grieving employee to be in the workplace versus them actually taking that time off to grieve. Now, once you've considered all of that, I would really sit back and think, does this actually look like a situation where this person is actually lying about their bereavement leave? And maybe they just want some time off. And what's leading me to think that way? Have they taken many times off in the year? What's the reason that they've provided? Well, recently, actually last month, we were dropping an auntie off at the airport. And it just so happened that the conversation started around this particular employee that she knows. And that's actually, funnily enough, a family friend of everyone. So we all know her very well. But she strategically would try to avoid any mandated or compulsory conferences that needed to be attended by the team. They were usually treated as strategy days and days when the team got together to upskill and understand the industry a little bit better. And it got to the point where every time there would be a conference on, she would say a particular family member passed away. For example, it might have been her grandmother. So I feel like after a couple of times, your grandmother, you usually have two in most scenarios. After that grandmother passed away a couple of times, then it became the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, the sixth time. And now you've got a lot of grandmothers that have passed away strategically around the time of the conference. And this was a reoccurring thing. Now, in those scenarios, I can see where the employer starts getting suspicious. Again, it's really important to take it case by case and tread lightly. Coming from certain cultural backgrounds, for example, myself being Fiji Indian on one side, Iranian on the other side, it's a big mix of people. There are aunties left, right, and center coming out of everywhere. But those aunties could be very close aunties in terms of my mum's sisters, or they could be very distant aunties where they're cousins and they're considered aunties in the culture. And you could have a situation where those aunties raised you. And I'm sure that happens across many, many different cultures. Now is when we get into the very controversial part, and that is requesting proof of bereavement. Ooh, I know it's a spicy one, but the law is really silent on proof of bereavement. It doesn't say anything in any of the sections of the Holidays Act. So what does this mean? This means that requesting proof can't be a condition for the employee taking bereavement leave. So you can't, as an employer, effectively say that I'm not going to give you this day of bereavement leave until you give me a piece of paper or some sort of proof that says that you have actually suffered a bereavement, like a death certificate or a statutory declaration. There are scenarios where I know that employers suspect an employee is taking advantage of bereavement. So yes, the legislation does not factor that in, and it does not allow you to create a condition on a person taking the bereavement leave. But what you can do is look at maybe having a policy or something in place which allows you to try and request that information. Now, this all kind of came up in that HRHQ community, and I could see that this question is a tricky question to navigate. If you are in a situation where you're suspecting an employee is taking advantage of bereavement leave, then you can see if they can provide a death certificate, a statutory declaration, but requesting proof, I would only say, comes up in suspicious circumstances. Be careful about that. And New Zealand is very, very clear in its employment law that you cannot request proof of pregnancy in situations where there's been stillbirths or miscarriages. This is for situations where you're dealing with multiple bereavements and they're probably related to, like I use that example, their grandmother always passing away. If an employer starts suspecting that there's a pattern happening, maybe you've got additional evidence or additional information. You see the employee posting on their Instagram, or maybe they've got something on their Facebook, then all of a sudden you've got a little bit more grounds to work with here in terms of the misuse of bereavement leave. Then in that scenario, I would say that you're not prohibited from requesting proof. There's no part of the law that says, no, you've done the wrong thing if you request proof, but your good faith obligations still apply. So that's where the law still kicks in. Under the employment relations legislation, your good faith obligations still apply, and this means that both you and the employee need to be responsive and communicative, and you cannot mislead or deceive each other in any capacity. So it's important for your employment agreements to have a clear clause in there that covers off bereavement leave, and that can be your stock standard clause. But like I said, where you take it that extra step further, but again, tread with caution here, is that you have a leave policy, and it could just be your basic leave policy setting out your sick leave, annual leave, and you can have something in there around bereavement leave and requesting proof of bereavement. Now, you want to make sure that if you ever start requesting proof in any scenario, that you're treating this across the board as an equal thing, not just targeting one particular employee. The wording that you might use in the policy is to support your request for bereavement leave. The employer may, at its discretion, ask for additional information regarding the bereavement. This could include, but is not limited to, documentation, such as a death certificate, statutory declaration, or obituary. It still allows you a little bit of breathing room to request this information. But again, it's a tricky one because it can seem like if you're getting into a combative situation where the employee is saying, no, I want you to provide me with the bereavement leave, I'm not going to give you the proof, then it will be really hard, to be honest, to try to discipline the employee or to go down that path because it can seem like you're not really acting in good faith and you're not being a fair and reasonable employer. Now, I wanted to wrap and tie things off by looking at what lies ahead for bereavement leave. The Holidays Act is changing, and what's changing for the Holidays Act is that there's new eligibility tests for bereavement leave. From the first day of employment, employees will actually be eligible and entitled to bereavement leave. Other employees will be eligible after 3 months if they meet new tests. And also, bereavement leave will be expanded so that employees can access 3 days of leave for more types of family members. I don't think pets are going to be on there, but you never know. So we'll see what happens as the legislation passes through. Now, before I go, I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Make sure that you're following the podcast and you're subscribing to Law Lens for these weekly insights. Now, that's it from me, everyone. Thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely day, night, evening, morning, whatever it may be. And guess what? I'll catch you in the next one, everyone.